Hello, I'm Gina Gutierrez-Karp, and I'm a restorative justice practitioner and educator. Today, we are going to become familiar with restorative justice in education. We're going to consider how restorative justice in education can support positive behavior and school climate. But first, I'd like to acknowledge something. Restorative justice in education was not invented 25 years ago by white people. It has its roots in ancient and indigenous traditions from native North America, Australian, New Zealand, and Africa. In the spirit of restoration, we humbly acknowledge that we work with adapted indigenous practices in colonized spaces after a long, violent history of cultural erasure. Restorative justice is also rooted in alternative dispute resolution. We align with these practices without claiming to be experts in the law or legal pathways, such as South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission or the Rwandan Gacaca courts. We share common values and strive for the same goal of reconciliation. When restorative justice was adapted by the Western world, it was to be an alternative response in the criminal justice system. It represented a huge pivot in our approach, a paradigm shift, where rather than center who was guilty, determine what they did, and how they needed to be punished, we are now looking at centering the harm. What harm was caused in this incident? What needs are being surfaced? Who needs to respond to those needs? And what will that repair look like? There's an enormous difference in approaching episodes of crime and wrongdoing in our society. And it's really taking off in certain parts of the country as a way particularly to work with first-time nonviolent youth offenders. When restorative justice is practiced in schools, it is more likely to be called restorative justice practices, because unlike being a conference that happens between a person who caused harm and the person who was harmed, that is responding to that incident of harm, it actually rolls back the tape and takes us back into where we can still be proactive or preventive. So we describe them as practices, and most of them are preventive practices. And we can work with a definition that has to do specifically with the schools. And this definition comes from Dr. Marilyn Armour from the University of Texas, and she tells us that restorative justice in schools, in K through 12 schools, is a way to shape student behavior and to achieve a positive school climate by three moves. We engage socially rather than use top-down disciplinary methods. We cultivate a sense of belonging rather than use exclusionary discipline, and we emphasize meaningful accountability over punishment. Most of us grew up in a world where justice was punitive, and very few of us, unless we come from an indigenous tradition, actually grew up in a world that takes a restorative approach. So let's do a side-by-side comparison of a punitive approach, a traditional approach that we are very familiar with, versus a restorative approach. First of all, in the punitive approach to discipline, we're focusing on a rule or a law that was broken. We're saying that justice means addressing a broken rule. In a restorative approach, we say that justice means addressing a broken relationship, a broken trust, or a harm to a person. So it's not what rule was broken, but what person was harmed in a restorative approach. In our traditional approach, justice is top-down. A person in the principal's office or at the judge's bench gets to make the decision about how justice is served. In a restorative approach, the people who are most directly involved get to decide what equals repair, what needs to happen in order to make things as right as possible. In our traditional approach to discipline, all of the focus is on the offending student, the student who broke the rule. In a restorative approach, we focus on the person who was harmed. We center the harmed party, and the harmed party might be a whole school community. But the focus is not just on who did it and how do we punish them. And that's because our focus on who did it and how we punish them produces defensiveness and dishonesty. And restorative justice at its core requires us all to take a moral journey, to build up our own integrity, accountability, and to lower our defenses so that when there has been an incident of harm, it is a safe culture in which to admit to what one has done and to be willing to clean up the mess or make the repairs happen. So rather than create more defensiveness, we're looking to build relationships where people are willing to admit what honestly happened. Finally, the difference between restorative justice and the traditional approach is that traditionally we think of justice as taking your medicine, taking your punishment, and that's what accountability looks like when you accept your punishment, whether or not that punishment makes sense, or whether or not it does anything for the person who was harmed or the community that was harmed. In restorative justice, we let go of all of that. Meaningless punishments have never changed any hearts and minds. We say, let's find out what needs to happen in order to set things as right as possible for the people who experience the impact of the harm. So what is it we're doing when we're deciding to become a restorative school? We're looking at taking up two activities, and one of them is fundamental to the other. First, we need to build classroom communities and practice empathetic listening and speaking. So our first goal is to build these classroom communities supported by clear agreements where we are able to practice empathy, have it modeled for us, practice active listening and authentic communication to bring issues and conflicts forward in a helpful way. When we have built that foundation, then we are able to use restorative justice practices to provide specific pathways to repair harms by bringing together those who are affected by misbehavior in a dialogue to address concerns, achieve mutual understanding, and come to agreement about what it takes to set things right. Restorative practices in this way are primarily preventative. What you can see from this image is that restorative justice practices can be viewed as three tiers. And that first tier is our tier of prevention. In tier one, we are building, strengthening, and maintaining our social relationships. And we're primarily doing this through the regular practice of community building circle. In our community building circles, we're not taking on the tough stuff. We are getting to know each other, and we're practicing the skills that we will need later. We are using circles before we need circles. If you go up the pyramid, you see that in tier two, that's where we're responding to incidents of harm. We're repairing relationships and repairing the community. It really takes a lot of practice at tier one to be great at tier two. But tier two is where our actual approach to school discipline can take place. And it looks like three things. It looks like enlarging our circle practice to be more than community building, but also responding to incidents of harm in our classrooms. It looks like the kind of chats between teachers and students that happen in hallways, playgrounds, lunchrooms, buses, all throughout our school system. But we're going to systematize those chats and create a question set that helps everybody practice for the third level of response, which is a restorative conference. A conference is the most formal manifestation of restorative justice. It's a response to a circle of harm, but that circle only now includes those who need to be there. A couple of facilitators, the person who experienced harm and their support person, the person who caused the harm and their support person. Finally, at tier three, we are using restorative practices to bring about positive, healthy re-entry of students who needed to experience, because it was inevitable, some kind of exclusion from school. And that could have been a chronic illness, it could have been extended travel, and it could have been a period of suspension or even incarceration. But we use our re-entry circle to welcome them back, reset our guidelines and our agreements about how we are with each other, and offer support to that student as they re-enter. You might be asking at this point, what makes a community building circle, that circle in the broad base of the pyramid, that foundational circle, what makes it different from the other ways that we gather? It is important to underscore here that circle is not group therapy, and it's not pedantic either. It's not a lesson. It's not something led by a teacher. Circle practices offer something completely unique. They're designed to develop and honor community. They are facilitated rather than taught or directed. They increase equity of voice among the participants. They encourage accountability. Finally, circle is based on story sharing, and stories engage listeners and are absorbed differently than advice or lesson giving. The primary difference of circle is that we are intentionally changing both the space and the pace of dialogue. And what does that mean? When we gather in circle, we gather with no furniture between us and nothing in our hands. We are practicing the art of presence with each other. We typically gather around a centerpiece, and that centerpiece is a symbolic campfire. It's the place where we meet in face-to-face community, and we're only there for the purpose of being in community. There's no other goal. That centerpiece can be just a restful place to rest your gaze if things get a little challenging. The centerpiece often represents the identity of a class or a group. If it's an English class, in the centerpiece might be a bust of William Shakespeare, or better yet, a bust of Toni Morrison. If it's a sports team, some of their equipment might be in the center, a lacrosse stick, a ball. It reflects back who we are when we gather like this. And it adds an element of ceremony. And the element of ceremony is the element that changes the mood of our circle space together. Often we use the centerpiece as a place to hold the group agreements so that they're visible to everybody, and also values that are important and cherished by each group gathering in circle together. Circle is also different from other ways of gathering together because the dialogue is regulated by the use of a talking piece. I like to call the talking piece the oldest new technology or the newest old technology. We borrow it respectfully from indigenous traditions. And when we use a talking piece, it's not just a random borrowing. The talking piece is what regulates full inclusion of every voice in the circle. Everybody knows that their turn begins when the talking piece comes to them, and their turn is over when they decide to pass it. And when it comes to them, they are absolutely free to say pass and keep it going around the circle. The talking piece not only regulates full inclusion, but it elevates the quieter voices in our groups. It makes sure that everybody has a chance to be seen and heard, and that our discussions aren't dominated by the same few voices. In addition to being a physical symbol of whose turn it is to talk and who has the floor, the slow passage of the talking piece around the circle encourages more reflective and thoughtful contributions as people see that it's coming to them. There's no popcorning and there's no sort of hand raising and the few dominant voices getting to take up all the air. It really is a thoughtful and slower way to talk to each other or process some content. Finally, the use of a talking piece provides one of the trauma-sensitive elements of circle. You see it coming and you can pass if this prompt is upsetting to you. And if you need more time, the amount of time you get is allocated by how long you're holding that talking piece. And sometimes adults and young people really just need to get something off their chest. Circles are as unique as the people who designed them, but they do follow a basic format. It's how we know we're in circle. Typically, our circles, we convene together and we state our intention. This is also a trauma-sensitive piece. For people who will find that this topic is hard for them, they can opt out at the moment the circle convenes. When we gather in circle, we often take a moment to practice mindfulness. These mindfulness activities need to be authentic to the people facilitating circle. They need to feel like the things that really do help you come into the present moment and feel centered and grounded, that you could also give as gifts to the students in your care. They have to feel real and meaningful. For some of us, it's a breath focus activity. For others, it's a sensory activity. For others, it's guided visualization. But all of these things have enormous benefit for our students, and circle is a perfect place to fold mindfulness into our daily and weekly work with our students. After gathering in circle and getting ourselves grounded, we often set the tone for the topic of our circle with a piece of inspiration, which could be a quotation or a poem, a song, a short reading. The inspirational piece is something that elevates the mood and elevates the conversation so that it can reach a little bit of a higher plane. After we get grounded, get inspired, one of the most important things that we do in a circle is affirm our agreement. It is extremely important to the circle process for the safety encourage of that space, that our agreements are co-constructed with the circle members, and that every time we meet in a circle, we actively affirm that these are the agreements that are important to us, and we create a moment to affirm or modify or add to the existing agreements. It's a living document that is subject to change. Typically, agreements include our values around respectful listening, around turn-taking, and that can be stated as, in the positive, as honor the talking piece. That's just saying don't interrupt each other, right? But we honor the talking piece and who has it. Respectful listening, or listening from the heart, means we are agreeing to spend more of our energy in circle listening rather than preparing our own answer or responding to what was said. Just to recap, when we have gathered, gotten ourselves centered, been inspired a little, and agreed, then we go into the actual meat and potatoes of circle, which are the content rounds. Now, if the agreements are incredibly important, I would say that first content round, the check-in, is incredibly important, because for some of us in larger groups, it's all we'll have time for, is to send that talking piece around and get a solid check-in from everybody. And if that's all we can do with our circle, it is magnificent and well worthwhile. It gives everybody in your class an opportunity to be seen and heard every day, which is so important to everybody's sense of belonging and sense that they have allies in the world who are checking in on them. So the check-in can be one of two types. There's the kind of check-in we ask that's really about taking the temperature of the group in that moment. How are we all doing? People use scales on a scale of 1 to 5, or they use metaphors like, what's the weather like in your head right now? Or what crayon color do you feel like? We just find out how people are doing as they enter circle. The other kind of check-in is, who are you? It's a who are you check-in. What do you like? If you were a vehicle, what kind of vehicle would you be? The kind of questions that elicit from us different ways of understanding and knowing each other, with the aim of having that mutual understanding go a long way towards practicing patience, tolerance, and compassion for one another. Following the check-in, if you have time, and I hope that you do, a facilitator might craft 1 or 2 prompts. And they can be on any topic. They can follow your SEL curriculum. And typically, the prompts would be, the first one would be a little bit of a lower risk prompt, something everybody could answer pretty easily. And the second prompt might take that topic a little deeper. An example I'd like to give is the first one for young children might be, if you're working on inclusion on the playground, tell about a time when somebody invited you to join a game. And the second round might be, tell about a time when it was hard for you to join a game on the playground. What did you need? What are some of the words or actions you needed from people at that moment? So it gives us a chance to offer story sharing as a way to address SEL content or behavioral content in the class without naming names and making it a top-down hierarchical decision about what needs to happen on the playground. We let the group really develop their own picture of who they are and and how they want to treat each other. Finally, we need to make sure that we close circle space, so that we always end our circles with a very definite closure, a checkout round. Now, this checkout round can be one word. In fact, at any point when you feel like time is short, you could establish a round that's a one-word round, a one-sentence round, and a round can even suspend the talking piece, and it can be a turn to your partner and share this kind of round. So we can always work with time creatively. Typically, a checkout round is a takeaway or a reflection, a way of wrapping up this discussion. And some people like to add the element of ceremony, where if they begin with the chime of a bell, they end with a chime of a bell. If they light the flameless candle, they turn off the flameless candle. They like to have that element where it feels like a whole, like a holistic piece. So circle is preventive. It's at that Tier 1 foundational level of restorative practices. And sometimes people say, well, how is that justice? And it's justice in its incredible dedication to inclusion and creating space for full inclusion in our classroom lives. But it also becomes justice when we can advance our community building circles into response to harm circles, when that same larger group, that same whole classroom or whole team or whole organization group can take on challenging topics together. Then we are beginning to use community to build responses to things that are harmful or damaging or hurtful. Regular circle practices help students and the adults who are working with them practice the skills they will need later in order to come into more difficult conversations following an incident of harm. It helps us practice and have in place better listening, more authentic speaking, empathy, the things that we're going to need if we're going to really work in community to solve the issues and conflicts of community. But sometimes that full circle is too big. It includes too many people, and we need to create a smaller circle. So that's when we bump up into a tier 2 practice of conferencing. And conferencing is that type of circle where we're definitely responding to an incident of harm between people, and we are definitely preparing them for that conference with pre-meetings, and we are definitely offering them the presence of support people, because these conferences often take place where typically exclusionary discipline would have happened instead, suspension or an expulsion, or something with a lot of consequence to it, a high impact incident of harm. If we're going to make this paradigm shift into being a restorative school, we need tools to be restorative in our approach. We know that conflict is inevitable, and we need to bring a conscious, awake, and compassionate self to these conversations. How does restorative conferencing support us in a difficult conversation? First of all, in many difficult conversations, we set it up as a win-lose battle. In a restorative conference, we do the opposite. We try to humanize each party to the other and understand and embrace the messiness of being human. And we do not try to oversimplify these problems that occur. We try to get a full and rich context around them. Another pitfall of a difficult conversation is the tendency to trivialize or dismiss the impacts and feelings of the harm, to make them smaller and more manageable. In a restorative conference, we give plenty of room for those impacts to be discussed and for those feelings and needs to be aired. In difficult conversations, we often find ourselves battling our own tendency towards defensiveness, and a restorative approach, one that has been built up from the bottom, creates a space where participants have already practiced de-arming themselves and practiced having conversations without needing to lose their cool or lose sight of the outcome, knowing that it is safe to be wrong and safe to make mistakes, and that the goal of this conference is to uplift and elevate everybody in it. Very often we feel like we need to create the safest possible space for everyone, and that's a very high goal, but we also know that we can't create the perfect safe space for everyone. But a restorative circle and a restorative conference aspire to create brave spaces for everyone that are supported by agreements, that are supported by format and supported by predictability and by pre-conferencing, so that everything that will be said at the conference has already been said to the facilitators. There will be no surprises, so that we can bravely enter into conflict with the goal of making things as right as possible. Both circles and conferences require that communities get really clear on their values, how we develop them, and how we commit to them. Leveraging the power of shared values is enormously supportive when it comes to responding to harmful behavior. The circle calls us to understand and own our beliefs about mistakes and mistake making, our beliefs about human dignity, our beliefs about inclusion, and our beliefs about relationships. So we know that community building circles are inclusive and that they support us to develop trust, mutual understanding, and shared agreements. We know that conferences are just tiny circles, including only the people who need to be there for the purpose of resolving an incident of harm. We can divide these tiny circles into two types: chats and conferences. A chat is the one-on-one talk you have with a student in the hallway or the playground or the lunchroom. In a restorative school, we agree to have that conversation be a short moral journey based on a commonly used question set. We'll be looking at that question set. Conferences are what take place on occasions when we might have used punitive discipline, such as suspension. Both chats and conferences are about discovering the root cause of a behavior through conversations that encourage reflection, accountability, and repair. Both use the same question set, a question set that is designed to help a person move from taking responsibility for harm, to understanding the impact, to identifying needs, to understanding what they need to do to repair the harm they caused. We use a similar question set for the person on the receiving end of harm to help them identify what it is they need in order for things to be set right. Now you're interested in restorative justice practices in schools. Here are a couple of resources that are really going to get you going. One is a book called Circle in the Square by Nancy Riestenberg, and another is a book called Circle Forward by Kay Pranis and Carolyn Boyes Watson. These two resources will help frame up even more concretely for you what restorative justice practices can look like in schools. Circle Forward is a set of circle templates, almost like a grab-and-go set of circle templates that can be used for many, many different occasions across many different age groups. What else can you do? You can create a leadership team of early adopters, people who want to be involved in moving this initiative forward in your school and see it through the days, weeks, months, and years of great implementation. You can get training for yourselves and eventually for your whole school in restorative justice practices. These trainings do not make you an expert. These trainings make you an apprentice, and then in your school, through peer coaching, through practice, through advanced trainings, you can gradually come to shift the culture of your school from being punitive to restorative. Even the people in your school who don't think that they'll be using or having a need to use conferencing or circle practice with students may find that both conferences and circles are really effective to use with adults, with the faculty and staff of a building. And it also helps if everybody is trained so that everybody uses a common language across the organization. Remember, these things take time. Culture change takes time. Be patient with yourselves. Have mercy on yourselves. Allow yourself the grace to make mistakes, to fail, to rise again. It will be worth it. Thank you so much for watching. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you today about restorative justice practices in education.